book on Spanish in contact, on phylogenetic approaches to the studies of restructured varieties of Spanish, which I will summarize, and Mikael Parkval, a real Viking in the snow here. We wrote an article together about Spanish pigeons. So I will basically going to be talking about three things today, and they are color-coded, so you can also follow more or less where we are. First about Spanish pigeons in a broader perspective, but I will begin with a pigeon that has not been mentioned before and which has not been documented, which is Pidgin Spanish of the Circum-Caribbean. And then I will talk about Spanish creoles in a broader perspective also, and then a little bit about Spanish in Garifuna in Central America. So for those of you who do not know where creoles are spoken and what type of language they are, you can see there's a belt with numbers and letters along the equator, and that is where basically all creoles are spoken. And the main reason for that is that there were the most resources that greedy powers went to get and used human labor for extracting those. And especially and there are creoles based on Dutch, English, Spanish, Arabic, Malay, Portuguese, and French. So these are some of the imperialist powers, and there is a part here which I focus on now. That's the Circum-Caribbean. Around the Caribbean Sea, there are quite a few creoles, English-based, Dutch-based, French-based, Spanish-based, and these are the most important ones on this map. So there's this concentration, but as far as pigeons are concerned, they are found much more widespread, so all the way from the Arctic to southern Africa and Patagonia. As you will see, this map was made a number of years ago by Mikael Parkval. As for Spanish creoles, there are only 3 locations where Spanish creoles have been documented. In the Philippines, a collective name Chabacano. There are 3 or more varieties of it. Then in the Caribbean area, Papiamento on the 3 islands, part of the Dutch Empire. And in Colombia, Palenquero. So first, something about what are pigeons and creoles. So pigeons and jargons are simplified and simple languages. They are created bottom-up in contact between at least one displaced group and another group, which could also be displaced. They come into contact with each other, and in order to communicate with each other, they create something, and also to keep the other at arm's length, because you don't want the others to know your language so that you can continue to speak your language. And pigeons have norms, so you can be a good speaker of a pigeon, and that is not the case with a jargon, which is more improvised and individual. So here is the history of Algiers in 3 pidgin sentences. Spanjoli venir boom boom andar, English venir boom boom bezef andar, Francis venir tru 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 chapar. So you can probably understand that. And this is the history I think from 1850s in a pidgin called lingua franca, which is a mixture of Spanish and Italian mostly, and a little bit of Arabic. So that's quite primitive, but you can understand what is meant, but it creates a lot of effort from the hearer. Whereas creoles are complete and complex languages that are created bottom-up, also on the basis of a simplified predecessor, and then the grammar was mostly based on lexical resources of the language, and through process of nativization, for instance, if a pidgin becomes a native language, or it becomes kind of a dominant language, then it will lead to expansion of the grammar, and the language gets everything it needs, and it becomes a complex language. So here, for example, Palenquero, you can see the sense. I will not read it aloud, but we have Hueba or Yueba, that is probably from fue bois, but that's not a correct phrase in Spanish, but it's the Spanish past tense suffix added to a verb, and the same for saber, which has gotten it's to know, which has gotten a habitual meaning. So lexical words have been developed to expand the grammar into a complete language. So now I'm going to talk about Spanish pidgins, and for this article we found around 20 of them, but most of them have not been documented to such an extent. You can say a little bit about that, and then also I think we can now, maybe not prove, but indirectly prove that there was a certain Caribbean pidgin Spanish, which is partly reconstructible, but only the lexicon. And then there are also Spanish pidgins when we talk about the area in northern South America spoken by Amerindians. There are some stories that there was a Spanish pidgin in the Corozal Free Trade Zone of Belize, but this MA thesis that I obtained from the author did not convince me that there was a pidgin, but there was a lot of code switching going on. So I'm going to talk now about this early context pidgin, and there are only indirect sources for it, but there's lexicons and widespread loans in Amerindian languages, in Arawakan languages, mainland Carib, island Carib, Carib pidgin, and also Diego also referred to some of these Spanish words in Amerindian languages. Trade objects are mentioned, and it's also the same set of words in all of the languages, and they are distorted in several ways, which is witness of the age of the time they were adopted into these Amerindian languages. And there are also very few actually metalinguistic remarks about the jargon, but it could be that there is more in Spanish sources that I'm not aware of. So it's of course best to look at Spanish loans in languages that were not in contact with, not spoken in areas where Spanish was the dominant language. So we are talking now about the three Guyanas, British Guyana, where the Dutch and the British were active, Suriname also the Dutch and the British, and French Guyana, the Dutch and the British, and of course the French. And also in the Caribbean, here you can see the islands and the different language, but I'm sure you know more about that than I do. And this is a list of Spanish loans in Surinamese Carib in a grammar by Berend Hoff in 1968, and you can actually find more of them also in later materials. Akusa needle, Arakapusa rifle, that's Arakabus, and Cabara sheep from Cabra, etc. You will be able to recognize many of them, and once you have seen that, we go to their supposedly traditional enemies, but as Nick also said earlier today, they are depicted as enemies, but there were also lots of context between them, including trading context. So this is French Guyana, modern language, modern Arawak language, and here I gave them a blue color if they were also found in the previous list, so you recognize many of the same words for dog and cloth. They're not, they do not always have the same form, but they are from the same set of words. And Berend Hoff also said that the fact that Spanish loanwords are also found throughout Eastern Guyana proves that their influence extended to that part of the country as well. And Douglas Taylor wrote that the early period of contact with Europeans left a considerable number of loanwords for innovations, and then he mentioned some in all the West Indian, Amerindian languages, so it was quite widespread. He said also that they were mostly from Spanish, but occasionally from Portuguese, but I'm not so sure about Portuguese. In the 1800s, there was a pidgin based on Wayana, a Carib language in French Guiana, and we find three Spanish words also there. Two of them we have seen before. And here we have, now we go back in time, 1640, and there was a Frenchman who said, and this, you can see the quote in French, and in English it would be, they have a certain jargon, a pidgin mixed with French, Spanish, English, and Dutch. And French, Spanish, and Dutch we can also confirm, but I have not found a single English word in that early period. Pidgin Carib was quite widespread and documented from the 1600s up to the 1900s, and here we have a few of the words in Pidgin Carib and these are all from the 1600s. Then we go to the islands, and there are also a couple of Spanish words in Lesser Antilles Pidgin French in the 1600s. So much for much and mañana for tomorrow. And these are different from the others, but yeah, and also have to say that some of these words have been continued into Lesser Antilles Creoles. There are a few Spanish words like ish for child. When I first heard that, I didn't know where it comes from, but it's, of course, hijo, old pronunciation, hijo. That is the source of that. But then also, and that has not been mentioned before, I think also that some of these words that have been attributed to Spanish or have no etymology are actually from Dutch, like Eshubara, that is closer to Dutch zwaard than to Spanish espada. And hirachi, I think that is from Dutch schaartje, schiertje. It could also, of course, be from tijeros, but the Dutch form is closer. So, and it's 100% sure, I think, for the last one, tishepulu, that must be from the word stevel, which is a boot in Dutch. Not a common word now, but it was at the time. And it's also, these things are mentioned as trade items in the sources of the Zeelandic Dutch, who were the ones who were active in the Guianas. Then also Venezuela, there was a missionary Pelleprat, and he had also words with the same range of meanings: ironware, imported animals, trade items, and clothing, and also some others. But here again, I have marked them in blue that are found in previous sources. So there is always an overlap of some words and words that are only documented in one source. And something which would be really nice is to have an inventory of all the early Spanish words in the indigenous language of the Guianas, including Venezuela and the Caribbean, which made it possible to potentially reconstruct these forms and also maybe to reconstruct the Spanish pidgin and look at the evolution in the different varieties. Some of it was already done in exactly 100 years ago. Erland Nordenskiöld, a Swedish anthropologist, linguist, published this book of all the maps and inventories of words for what he calls words used for things introduced by Europeans. And you can see the list here, and we have seen some of them already. And he has maps for all of America, really useful, but a more detailed study of all of the words in the north and in the Caribbean would be really interesting. The fact that they are shared and that they are so widespread is connected to a theoretical observation made by Cecil Brown in 1999 in his book Lexical Acculturation in Native American Languages, where he looked at introduced things in the Americas and what they are called. Are there loan words, or do they make a new word themselves? And he said that pidgins and lingua francas, they are often an important source for borrowing into local indigenous languages, and that confirms that these words must go back to a pidgin of the time. So that was lexicon, but now we go to structure, and then we go to other Spanish pidgins, because this one has we don't know anything about it. And if you think about pidgins, what people do is you have to simplify things. So you, instead of using words that are conjugated or declined, you use only one form for the verb, only one for the noun, only one for pronouns. And then the choice is often that, when we are talking about European-related creoles, it's often the object pronouns or the emphatic pronouns rather than the subject pronouns. And for the verbs, it's usually the infinitive rather than the most frequent form or whatever people could have chosen. And there's, of course, a huge advantage to that. You reduce the complexity, and it's easier to communicate, which is the goal of these contexts, and it's also easier to learn. So it's a very rational decision to simplify the language in these kind of situations. And these patterns are typical, but not universal, for Dutch, French, Portuguese, English, etc., pidgins and creoles, where you have these categories. So this is an example from the lingua franca, the pidgin spoken from the Middle Ages, maybe up to around 1900 in the Mediterranean, Romance-based, also Arabic influence. And here I'm not sure whether you can read them, but the first sentence, acusi, mirar como mi estar barbero bono. And all the red squares are infinitives, and all the blue squares are object pronouns, and me in this case. So that is an arbitrary example of what most pidgins have chosen as a strategy, and that this is from a theater play. There were Africans speaking in theaters. These are the only examples we have, apart from lingua franca of Spanish, and here we find the same thing. Mi derramar, mi andar, aguar, no ser, porque gritar. So that's also the same thing in a different situation. So these choices made, this simplification of paradigms, very rational, but there's only one base for pronouns, nouns, and verbs. But why not subject pronouns? Why not possessives? Why not compounds, like in African American vernacular English, where you say my ass, those kind of things? And why not gerunds in the verb? Why not third person forms, which are quite frequent? Why not past participles? Why not imperatives? And the interesting thing is, when you look at the Spanish pidgins, you find everything of that except for these compounds, but I think that has nothing to do with easiness of expression. So we find subject pronouns, possessive, gerunds, past participles, third person pronouns, and also probably also a couple of imperatives, but they're not always easy to distinguish from other forms. Philippine Creole Spanish, como aquí si suya cristiano. So how is it here if you, why are you here if you are a Christian? Como puede Anchina? So here we have a third person form for how can you do like this? And other forms in other parts of this Philippine pidgin Spanish are also puede, pensa, so that could be third person, but we're not really sure. And also mia for mine, and also nosotros as we, and we find that also in other forms, other pidgins. Then maybe the southernmost pidgin document, the Patagonian trade jargon Spanish, in unpublished work by Sarah Roberts, with data stretching 60 years in the 19th century. And there are there's quite a bit of variety in the verb forms. Quiere for want, so that's probably a third person form. Habla probably also. And past participle, hablau, and also in the later period also infinitives mirar, estar, decir, querer. An example of that, there's somebody showing a wooden sculpture of Jesus Christ, and then this person asks, "Quiere mirar mi Cristo, mucho quiere mi Cristo tobacco." So that's an invitation to give tobacco to this person. And the other sentence here, "Ingus hablau," so that's the past participle. Much mentir, so Indians tell many lies. Hablau malo, so they speak bad. And then we go to another trade language in Ecuador, and here we find gerunds instead. So nosotros, blanco no queriendo, no, we don't want white people. Este blanco mucho no bueno tiene, that's a third person form, but that is, we don't know exactly what it means, but it's often put in the end of the sentence, and it is the only form which doesn't have a gerund ending. Tuyo no sabiendo leña cortando, so you don't know how to cut wood, and here we find a possessive also. And that is also true for Tucanoan speaking group, where a contemporary observer in 1912 said, but they all speak more or less Spanish with the peculiarity that the only form of the verb they use is the gerund. So it's a kind of an aerial trait of the area. We'll get one more example. Philippine Kitchen Spanish in the late 1800s used third-person verbs, possessives as pronoun, and con as an object marker, which is also found in the Creole Spanish there. But it's not this area, and there's a pidgin called chileno, because traders from Chile came to California, traded with the native people there, and there was somebody who remembered her parents speaking this. So, yo no entiende usted, and that's I don't understand you. And in this pidgin we find only third-person verbs like puede, tiene, viene, da, and also nominative pronoun forms yo, usted, and nosotros. Chinese Cuban Spanish, we find, for the verbs, we find infinitives and imperatives and pronouns, object pronouns, and subject pronouns. So we are in a chronological order now. Philippine soldier talk, there's only a few sentences, but there it's habla, quiere, vamos, and there's not much we can say about, and the pronouns appear to be English, that were also American soldiers. Trade Spanish of the Piñaguero Panar in Venezuela, also gerunds. You cannot read that, but I will read it aloud. Yo, caminando, patriota, that's the name of a place. Allá, pasando, loquisis, that's the name of a river. Vendiendo tewa, and that's the word for basket in the native language. I'm going to take a trip to Patriota on the other side of the Coquisses River to sell baskets. And we made a table of that. You cannot see that, but here are several categories from left to right, and the pidgins with enough documentation from top to bottom. And I'm going to summarize it here. So the Spanish pidgin display an enormous and exceptional structural diversity. They are sometimes verb medial. We have seen some verb final in the north of South America, and also marginally verb initial pidgins. The sources of the pronouns are quite diverse, also object, subject, and possessive. And second person pronoun is a little bit special, and there we find a whole range of them. And also for sources of the verb, we encountered infinitives, third person, and gerunds as more or less systematic in this particular pidgins, and then marginally also imperatives and past participle. And then also we looked at copula. Sometimes they use estar, and sometimes zero copula. So that was our big discovery, actually, that there is so much diversity, and that also means that all these pidgins emerged independently from one another, which is not that amazing, but you only find regional traits like with these gerunds. So now we go to creoles, and if you didn't know that before, you have learned that in the past couple of days. So Creole language in Central America, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Belize, and they are all English lexifier creoles. Maybe you think, what about Garifuna, spoken in Belize, Nicaragua, Honduras? We heard also more about that. And then I know that people often ask Diego, oh, it's a Creole. No, it's not. It's not a Creole. It's an Amerindian language. But it's spoken by people of overwhelmingly African descent, and their ancestral language is Island Carib, which is now extinct, which was spoken on the Lesser Antilles. It is a contact language, one could say, but because there is considerable lexical and grammatical influence from other languages, notably Carib, and also a little bit about the lexicon later. So remember, there are these three Spanish creoles: Philippines, Caribbean, and Colombia. And just to give you an example of the Papiamentu, instead of having to say bienvenido, bienvenidos, bienvenida, you just say bon bini, then you have everything and everybody at the same time. Same as bon tardi, no worries about gender. And there are some other constructions like conta by cubo, how como estar by for to go, con vos, and that is basically a calque on Dutch, and it's like how is it going with you? So there, so that gives you an impression of Spanish Creole. Where does the lexicon and the structure come from? And this is a very rough calculation, estimation of where things come from. So sometimes it says that Creoles are mixed languages. I do not agree with that statement. The lexicon is less mixed than in other languages like Arabic and English and Dutch, just to mention some languages spoken by people here as native languages. Here in Creoles, it's 90% from the lexifiers and maybe 5% from substrates, and in the Atlantic situation, it's often African languages. The grammar is around 20% from the lexifier, so that's not a robust transmission of the grammar as has been claimed, but and I'm going to show you in a little while why, and around 5% maybe from substrate languages, and a lot of it of the grammar is innovated. This innovation has never had a big, has never received a lot of attention, as people have been looking for universals or substrate features or continuation of the lexifiers, but actually most of it is innovated. And you can use, we used phylogenetic networks to investigate creoles. What are they? So it's this computer software developed by biologists to track evolution on the basis of similarities. They started with superficial similarities, like does it have fins or does it have wings, those kind of things. But now it's all based on DNA. And you can, of course, you can apply to other evolutionary products like languages, and that has been done for almost 2 decades now. And you can, with these programs, you can make trees of descent, and you can also make networks where, either contact influences or uncertain sources also play a role. And you can make networks with horizontal transfer, that's borrowing and uncertainties. If you do that on the lexicon, and this is from a program developed at the Max Planck Institute called the Automatic Similarity Judgment Program. 40 words of the 40 of the most stable words from the Swadesh list were supposed to give so much information that you can make a tree of the languages of the world. And for the European language, it fits very well. What you see here is French-based creoles, and they're close to French. I marked that with a blue line. And Portuguese-based creoles and Spanish-based creoles, they are a bit mixed, but they also quite close to both Spanish and Portuguese, also because they are not that different from one another. So lexically, there's no doubt that they are very close to French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and you find the same with English and Dutch and the creoles based on those. Now you can do interesting things with that. You can put data in the system, and then you can get this star-like figure, neighbor joining tree, where you ask the program just to look at similarities and not assuming any process of contact. And of course, you can use that for anything without assuming evolution. And the previous one, of course, assumes evolution from a source called French, and then you have a development. And this network on the right is shows these squares or these lines which go from one to the other. They denote that the program is in doubt, and that means that it's not 100% certain where this belongs, so therefore you have a network. And I'm going to show you some phylogenetic networks of varieties of Spanish, and there are these from Central America, 3 varieties of Costa Rican Spanish, the Central Valley, that's where we are now, Guanacaste, Nicoya in the north, and then the Caribbean coast, and then we have only one language from the other countries, I'm sorry about that, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. This is not, of course, there is a lot of variation also in these countries. And this is the result based on, I don't remember the number, but over 100 features. And here are the Andes languages. Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, so they cluster a little bit. Argentina is here, Uruguay, Chile, so that's the southern part. And then we have Central America here, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Mexico here, variety of Mexico. And then we have the Circum-Caribbean, where we also find Costa Rica and Panama, Colombia, and Paraguay is here. So this, we saw also, I think it was Auxiliadora who showed a list of varieties of Spanish, and this is very close to that one. But these are all varieties of Spanish, and there are some regional clusters. And what if you add Afro varieties, Spanish spoken by descendants of Africans, and what if you add data from creoles and media lengua. Here are all the languages you saw before, all the varieties of Spanish. Here we have the African varieties, Bolivia and Ecuador, and I forgot the third one. And here we have the Zamboangueño Creole of the Philippines, and this is Papiamentum, this is Palenquero. So what you can see in this graph is that the varieties of Spanish are actually very close to one another. The African varieties are deviant from them, and the creoles are very different from them, and also media lengua, which is basically a variety of Quechua in which all the lexicon is replaced with Spanish, and hence a mixed language. Then there are also a number of indigenized Spanishes, and especially for Ignacio, here we have Judeo-Spanish, and this is Equatorial Guinea Spanish and Philippine Spanish. So these are varieties that are spoken by people who originally had a different language as their mother tongue, but they shifted to Spanish. This shows the same as you saw this before, but I didn't tell you then that we were talking about 18 creoles and then these different types with 7 different lexifiers, and these are not very much clustered along the lines of lexifiers. We have Philippines here, Papiamento here, Palenquero there, and what we did was we started adding non-creoles, and then we selected those because there is a prejudice that creoles have not much morphology. From we selected from big language families the one which has least morphology, and they all end up in a cluster. And this is what we always found, that creoles cluster in one part of the typological space of the languages of the world, sometimes with Western European languages mixed in with them. What would happen if we add African languages from a line along the coast, say 400 kilometers in the area where we know that Africans were abducted to work in the New World? What would happen if we add those? And here I refer to the idea that creoles are languages with African structures and European lexicon. Well, when we do that, we get a graph like this. Here we have, the basis of this were stable, supposedly stable aspects of grammar, and here are all the African languages, and here are all the creoles, and we have Haitian French, Martinique French, Palenquero, Berbice Dutch Creole, Jamaican English Creole, Gala English Creole, Vincentian English Creole, Virgin Islands Dutch Creole, Louisiana French, Papiamento Spanish, Guyana French, and Saramaccan English/Portuguese. So the lexifier does not influence, they do not cluster along the lines of the lexifier. One thing you can also do with these phylogenetic programs is you can root them and say, hey, we have data, but we know that they all derive from Spanish. And you can do that for the lexicon, and Spanish is the first branch because that's the root. Papiamento is, as far as the lexicon is concerned, closest to Spanish, then Palenquero, and then the three Philippine creoles. I see Nick nodding because he will recognize that, because there's quite a bit of Tagalog and other Philippine languages lexicon in it. But on the right, there are the phonological features, and that gives you a different distribution, where Palenquero is closest to Spanish, and then two of the Philippine languages, and after that Papiamento and Ternateño Creole, which is also spoken in the Philippines. Now we have a graph with all the Spanish and Portuguese creoles from the world, so as far as they are documented. And here you can clearly see geographical patterns. India, South Asia, Philippines, South Asia, that's Indonesia and Molucca. Papiamento, here we have Gulf of Guinea creoles, Portuguese-based. The blue ones are Portuguese-based Guinea coast creoles. We have Palenquero here. So here we do find regional clusters. You can then also, we took also just the Spanish creoles and the two lexifiers, not only Spanish, but some Spanish and some Portuguese. Spanish and Portuguese, you can see the distance the symbolic distance, and the creoles are quite far from each other. And the distance, say the physical distance between the languages also indicates how far apart they are. So the creoles are just as different from one another as Spanish and Portuguese, but the lexifiers are very different from the creoles. When I said this, there was this 20% continuity, well, that's based on this graph, and in fact for Spanish and Portuguese creoles, it's 26% continuity, but it's for the whole. We did it for all creoles for which we have a lexifier with at least 2 creoles. So we have Arabic also, and French, and English, and Dutch, and but Spanish, for the Spanish and Portuguese creoles, it's a little bit higher. You cannot read this maybe, but there's a lot of no's, no. There's also a couple of yes, and I will go into that now. So these 5 Iberian creoles selected were Papia Cristang from Malacca Straits, Korlai from India, Casamanche from Senegal, Tanateño from the Philippines, Papiamento from the Caribbean. And here you can see some of the features, a reduplication. None of the lexifiers have any reduplication, but all the creoles have relexification. So that's an innovation, and that's 0% continuity. Definite article is also 0%, even though all the lexifiers have definite articles, and all the creoles have definite articles, except for Korlai. But all the definite articles are derived from demonstratives in the lexifier. So that's not a continuation. So that's how we counted it. And here we have lots of zeros, only plural, because Casamanche Creole has Portuguese S as a plural marker. But on this part, we see higher numbers, so the order of possessed in the noun phrase, like house, my, or my house, that is at 60% continuation, but here we have also a high number for position of negative, and that is because no has the same form and the same position in Spanish and Portuguese creoles, but we find the same in French creoles, for instance, with pas, which is post-verbal in French, but pre-verbal in the creole. And this could be chance, but of course we have to count that, and that's how we found for these stable elements that we only have 26% continuation. And this is basically the same graph again. And the final thing I'm going to talk about very briefly is about Garifuna. And there we also have some older Spanish loans. And of course, today, Garifuna is spoken in countries where Spanish is an official language, but it comes from the Lesser Antilles, and there the official languages were mostly French, actually, and sometimes English. So it's a Central American language, but it's originally from the Lesser Antilles, and it was brought to Central America from St. Vincent by the British, who deported the Black Caribs in 1797. So the Caribs had been defending their island, taking St. Vincent as the base, and it was only in 1797 that they finally lost their power, and the Brits looked at the skin color of people, and depending on the skin color, they could stay on the island or they were deported to an island off the coast of Honduras, from where they moved to the mainland. Two recent grammars, one by Diego and one by a fellow of mine, Stefan Auerholm Larsen, published around the same time. And here are some Garifunas, and in the 1600s, and this is maybe 2005, and so they are of overwhelmingly African ancestry, and yeah, so they are an Amerindian group, but they are physically African. And the question is, of course, how come that these people speak an Amerindian language, and it's an Arawakan language, but they call it Carib because Garifuna means Carib. And also, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, since when have Africans been part of island Carib society? There's a lot of things to say about the Garifuna, but here I think I had to contribute a little bit to this. One story is that there was a shipwreck in 1675 of African slaves who were saved by the Carib, were adopted by them, and they were completely culturally assimilated, apparently, and learned the language. But this cannot be correct. One, there is no fitting shipwreck documented. There are several catalogs of shipwrecks, and I went through them, and there's nothing that could fit that. And also there were Africans living with the Caribs before 1675, and the main argument is the earlier raids on Spanish settlements with Amerindians, Spanish and Africans as bounty. And here is an early picture of their ships. Later they were even much bigger. One from the island of Margarita, which is here, and Trinité, that's the Spanish word for Trinidad. So they were sailing there, and here is one picture from 1614, where on the right you can see the Caribs who chased the Spanish ships away in 1614. And the Spanish were actually quite scared of the Caribs, and for good reasons also. And a French researcher has went through the Spanish archives, and this is, you cannot read it, but this is a list of all the raids that have been documented by the Spanish of the Caribs on ships to raid the settlements either for goods or for people. And the first one is 1509, Puerto Rico. The first ones are all against Puerto Rico. And here it says they took 50 captive Indians with them. And then the first time, here is also, they took 150 Indians in 1562 and 3 Spanish people. And here, 1567, Puerto Rico, the Caribs took away black people. So that is the first time that is documented in this list, and there are a couple more. They took slaves, assuming that they were blacks, but they could also have been Indians here. 36 blacks and Indians in 1572. And most of these attacks were on the island of Margarita, which had already become Spanish, and Puerto Rico, but also Trinidad and other places, but especially Puerto Rico. And of course, that was a Spanish colony, and these people would have learned some Spanish here, and there are a number of Spanish words in island Carib. That's, of course, where we have to look at, because if we look at Spanish words in Central America, they could be recent loans, and we have these in the 1650s, so coffer, pin, wire, violin or string instrument, a comb, and you recognize some of the words from earlier sources, so this also indicates that this was part of this. Somehow these words came from the same source, and that must have been a Spanish pidgin. And the semantic domains of these Spanish loans also suggest that the early trade items, weapons, and food and drinks, and how you store them, household items like clothing, jewelry, decoration, cultural innovation, and that is because of the Spanish dominance in the region. Then also there are French loans in Carib, over 200. The numbers are French, and so elementary words like sheep, French, sugar, pine wood, sugar cane, but also some more abstract words like time, 2 cents, feel, and a range of religious terms, which is not surprising because French-speaking missionaries were active there. But it's not always easy to recognize the French loans here. Sorry if I pronounce it wrong. La agumacera ad di mureja. He started to speak, and that is commencer, almost unrecognizable, and témoin, to witness, as a word for to speak. And here again, I've shown this already, but I thought I should show it again, these Dutch words, which also played a role there. Overall, the loans in Island Carib and Central American Garifuna, well, de Goeie, a Dutch scholar, he had gone through all of the sources, almost 3,000 words from the work of this missionary Breton in the 1600s, and he found 262 loan words, 53 from Spanish, 209 from French, and Taylor, based on these data and his fieldwork in Honduras and Belize, had very similar numbers and also a number of English words. How much time have I left? 5 minutes? Okay, then I'll also do this, because this is something that has been fascinated me for a while, and you may know that Cartagena in Colombia was the center of the slave trade, and there is actually a book by a missionary who was actually interested in the people for their cultures and where they came from and what languages and what ethnic groups, and he was called the slave priest, and he gives also a list of ethnicities, and just especially for Nick, who has spent a lot of time in Nigeria also, there are a number of groups from Nigeria that I underlined that he mentioned. But the fascinating thing is also that in some of these sources, but I did not do a systematic study, there are observations of black people who do not seem to be slaves but free traders. And here there are some, here a letter in 1612. Some Negroes that I caught from an English ship have assured me that there are 40 houses of English and Flemings in the settlement, and with 80 people in it. And then he also says, and that's below there, 100 Indians and Negroes as rowers. Then there is also a very fascinating account of a group of British people who were on their way to Guyana, I think, but they stranded on St. Lucia. They were received very well by the Caribs, the locals, but when they but the relations became worse, and they ended up getting a boat from the a pirogue from the Caribs with food for a couple of days, and they were sent off. And they ended up in Venezuela, I think a month or more later, at least. I think only 3 people survived, and then when they finally reached the coast, he writes, within 2 days after the stranded British settlers on the way to the Guyanas met with 3 Spaniards and with half a dozen Indians and Negroes traveling from Caracas to Coro, driving horses and mules laden with merchandise. And then especially it's fascinating is, and that's only known from a dissertation written in Dutch a number of years ago, the Dutch trade in Guyana already in the 1500s. They had friendly contacts with the locals, but they distinguish between 2 different groups, the Indians and the blacks, Indianen and Zwarte. And sometimes people have, the author thinks maybe they were just darker than the others. But if you look at all of them, it's not very likely. I think there were already black people, and my theory is that the Arawaks raided them from beyond Trinidad and took them back to the Guyanas. Okay, that was a little bit about the island Caribs, and there were also sometimes there is an idea that these the island Caribs were quite different from the mainland Caribs in the sense that they came from there, but they had settled there. No, they had constant contact. And one of the pieces of evidence is the dictionary also that was made. You have lots of terms for relating to going to the mainland, so this is a lexicalized form for a trip to the mainland, or to even for your equipment that you take when you go to the mainland, and also jewelry that you get from the mainland, animals from the mainland. So there was constant contact. So about this, island Caribs were part of a trading and raiding network, influence from Carib and Carib pidgin, and influence from Spanish pidgin, and this black presence was earlier than often assumed. Final conclusions about pidgins: grammatical diversity of Spanish pidgins is extreme and revealing. Most Spanish pidgins, they emerge independently of one another, not surprising as it happened in different parts of the world. And somehow an arbitrary choice is made for uninflected nouns, verbs, and pronoun forms. Then creoles, Spanish creoles have innovated around 80% of their grammatical system compared to Spanish. Creoles are structurally more similar to each other than to their lexifiers, and the three Spanish creoles are not closer to each other than they are to other creoles from a structural point of view. Finally, Garifuna, not a Creole language, contains traces of a Spanish trade pidgin of the Caribbean Sea. The Carib part of Garifuna goes partly back to the well-documented pidgin Carib of the Guyanas, and Africans may have been part of their society from as early as 1567. And that was my last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias a Peter Bakker por esa interesante presentación. Tenemos 20 minutos para bombardeo de preguntas. A ver, las pueden hacer en inglés, en español, en holandés, en danés.
Euskara.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So, regarding the first part of your talk, can you be sure that the examples that you find in your sources are really examples of a pidgin in the sense that you define pidgin at the beginning, as opposed to examples of imperfect second language acquisition by adults?
Okay, I started with this lexicon of Circum-Caribbean, but you mean the structural part of pidgins.
What you call Spanish-based creoles, Spanish-based pidgins, sorry, yeah. Spanish pidgins. Yeah. Are those really examples of pidgins, or just somebody yeah. who speaks Spanish as a second language yeah. In an imperfect way? In the way that I've been learning Swedish with Duolingo. If you see a representation of my Swedish, you may conclude, well, that's pidgin Swedish. Well, somebody whose Swedish is not very good.
Yeah, that's a good question, and then you have to rely on several sources. So if there are several people speaking in the same way, then it's most likely that it's a pidgin rather than individuals who have picked up a little bit of Spanish and tried to communicate and has learned a little bit of Spanish as a second language. So of course the number of sources is very small, so it's very difficult to be sure about that. But if you have sources that say, well, this person, and then this is quoted, and another one is quoted, then it's. I think we are on safe grounds to say that they are pidgins rather than individual attempts at second language learning. But it's not certain in all cases.
You mentioned the extreme structural diversity that you find in the example. That could be an indication that...
Yeah, but when I say extreme diversity, okay. Extreme diversity from one pidgin to the other. But all of these in the north of South America, they all use gerunds, for instance, and only gerunds. And that is very different from what is found elsewhere in Spanish pidgins. But there are some, like in Patagonia, there I think you would have a case where it's less certain that it's a pidgin because there is so much difference in the Spanish constructions.
Anyone else? I have an observation to make. You didn't include Garifuna in the diagrams.
Of the creoles?
Or all the, yeah. It was not there. Or have you tried at least also to do that mapping between Garifuna and Guajiro, for instance?
Not me, but people in Lyon have done that. So they have made, they use the same software, but these people are really specialists in it. They made networks and trees of Arawakan languages. And
what was the place of Garifuna there? What did they come up with?
It's kind of an outlier within Arawakan.
Is it?
Yeah. I can find them for you. I think they have published it also like somewhere.
That,
yeah.
Great.
So it's not part of the core of Arawakan, but it's in
the unrooted ones, in the unrooted trees.
Yeah.
Or in the networks.
I think both. I don't remember exactly.
Okay. Good. Okay, I'd like to see that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Peter. What we could see here in your presentation, it's that creoles are more alike among themselves to their lexifiers, right? And if compared to even their structural language, that will be the languages of the west coast of Africa, let's say, right? So I can see the point that we are making in saying, well, that moving on the Creole exceptionalism, right? But if the features are not taken from a pool, as Mufwene and de Graaf, all of them talk about, where from, right?
Yeah.
Why are they so apart from the two parents, right? In terms of features, in terms of lexicon. If not from there, what's happening there? What's causing that they are so close together, but not showing? Haitian Creole and Limonese Creole can be closer than Limonese Creole is to English, let's say, according to these graphs. So that would be a question that I've always wanted to ask and see what the answer is.
First, I have to say that this graph of the African language and the Creoles is not something that I want. It's just we use the data, put them in the machine and see what gets out. And then we get this result. And this was based on features from walls, but you get the same thing if you use, say, stable grammatical features. And when you say that, you mentioned Mufwene and Mufwene's feature pool, but Mufwene never applied it to anything. And the graph is also very data poor. So when they are not happy with these results, it's for ideological reasons and not for scientific robustness. They have also good arguments to be careful with those kind of results, because in the 19th century there was this ideology that Creoles were more simple because the people were more simple, and that is of course complete nonsense. But then the second part of your question is, why are Creoles more similar? And I think that is because of the unity of humankind, that we are all the same and wherever we are, and we need to make a new language. We use the same resources, and they are not based in biology, because if you think of Bakker, who claimed that in the 1980s with the bioprogram, they are based in pragmatics. You want to convey something, and then when you want to express a verb, then some verbs are stative and some non-stative. And that is a very basic semantic thing to convey, and that has an influence on Creole grammar. And then there are other things as well. So you do not continue the tense marking if it's morphological or whatever, but it's apparently more pragmatically salient if you put an element before that based on some lexical element from your language. And then the fact that people from Papua New Guinea to Ramakei to Louisiana end up with languages that are quite similar. Okay, there's also a lot of diversity among the creoles. So you only find these things if you use masters of data. So some people have also said, this is not good because there is a counterexample. No, of course there are counterexamples, but they are also already integrated in all the material because all the data are in there. So that's my explanation that humans do the same thing all over the world, no matter what their skin color is or whatever their language background is. I have to say also, this 5% of substrate, that was something that we came up with, or maybe I would say I came up with, but there is also a Japanese scholar who, in a very strange article, but he also did that, and he came with exactly the same numbers as I presented on the basis of a computational model that I don't quite understand.
Thank you, Peter. I also have one question regarding language universals, because what you have done using this software, I think it goes like a step forward in analysis of language universals, because you can see the similarities and the differences among all the creoles and pidgins, right? And that will confirm, or probably refute some of the ideas that there are already in theory about, something like an interlanguage, or that it exists or it doesn't exist, right? Or if we are using default features when constructing a new language like a creole, so basing not on the not taking the parameter, if you think so in terms of parametric theory, not in terms of what the Spanish does or French does or Dutch does, in terms of like the use of copula or head first, head last. So with your analysis, do you think you could construct a set of characteristics that are universal, that are like default characteristics of languages, and therefore you could construct a language based on those characteristics, which are by default, not learned, but when you don't find the evidence, then you just fill in like a default feature.
Yeah. Okay, when we talk about universals here, we are not talking about universals for all languages, but about universals in a creolization process.
No, I'm talking about universals in language in general,
yeah.
And how creoles provide evidence based on this is something that has been done before, but now with with this software you're using, where you can feed in all this data, then I think it gives you a tool, a very strong tool to prove that.
But if these are universal features, then you would find them in both creoles and non-creoles. So then the result would be...
In terms of if you don't, the idea is that if you don't have the evidence for the feature, then you use a default feature. And that's what I'm talking about, the default. Not Spanish or Bantu language or any other language, right? But an intermediate feature, something that is neither nor. I don't know if the question is clear.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. So
okay, but let's say copula. Okay, this is the verb to be, and then the theory says that the verb to be is not common. So many languages don't use it. So in creoles, they usually no verb to be, right? Even if we have a verb to be in Spanish.
That's a bit more complicated. But let's take to have, because to have, we may think that it's very common, but it's actually common in Europe, but not in the rest of the world. Like Finnish doesn't have a verb to have, and Russian doesn't have it, and many languages of the world don't have it. But all the creoles have it. But they do not use the verb to have from the lexifier, but they use maybe to gain or to obtain a stronger verb, which becomes the verb to have. And I think that's where you can point to universals. You know that an element with a stronger, more lexical meaning will be used and grammaticalized, but you can never be sure which lexical element will be used in a creole. And I think also that's different from ordinary language things. Okay, I also have to say that there's nothing in a creole that you cannot find in non-creole languages. So in that sense, they are completely normal languages. But there are also properties that you find in non-creoles that are not found in creoles. But that's also because there are many fewer creoles than non-creoles.
Okay, one of the examples of Spanish-based creoles, and they use the gerund, right?
Yeah, that was these were pidgins, not creoles.
Pidgins,
there are no creoles that use the gerunds.
And you find that in like French-based pidgins or Dutch-based pidgins, the same pattern of using the gerund instead of the...
No, but I think they're more salient in Spanish. But I know that in second language research you find people overusing ing in English, which is comparable to the Spanish gerund. So that would point to what Ignacio was saying about the possibility of that being a feature of second language learning.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When Stavros Kopeteas and I apply this software to the situation, to the aerial situation in Central America, and we came up with a transition zone that was in just beginning to take shape in mid-50s, 150s. The question we were asked is, okay, what did you feed in? What information did you feed the software with? Then we said, okay, it was walls features. Yeah. And the question was, okay, now, because you inserted walls features, you got these results. What if you inserted forms? Actual forms, not features.
You cannot
Would you get the same results?
Yeah, okay. You can use forms, but only for creoles based on the same lexifier. Yeah. And that's why you have to use grammatical features when you want to compare across creoles.
Exactly. But one thing we know from contact is that the first thing you take sometimes is the form itself, rather than the feature. Yeah. Languages don't borrow features at first. They borrow forms. Yeah. So the question, and it remains to be answered, is how representative of the actual situation these results are if we take into consideration that we're not using actual forms but features. Yeah. And this remains open.
It remains open, yeah. But as I said, you cannot use forms in this case unless you do, for instance, a study of all the Iberian creoles. Then you can also use forms. But I'm not sure how much we would learn from there. Probably you get also kind of a regional clusters. And I also have to say that we used many different sets of features and we get different results. And sometimes people say, hey, you used existing features, that's wrong. And sometimes, but if you select your own features, then they would also say it's wrong with more justification, because then you could have cherry-picked the features to get certain results. And sometimes also people have said that, yeah, but these features were selected to be typical of creoles, and then you applied them to non-creoles, and of course you don't find them. But that's also a strange argument, because if you want to say, compare fish with non-fish, and you define a couple, you say fish have fins, and how do you call these things? And they have they live under the water, etc. And then you apply that to other animals, then you would find this difference. But there's, of course, nothing wrong with that. You have selected features that are typical for one type of animal or language, and then you compare to others, and then you get different results. There's nothing wrong with that. That's also like people say, natural science have definitions of rivers or planets, and then they investigate Pluto, and sometimes they change their criteria, and then Pluto is a planet and then not a planet. So that in all branches of science, people do that.
Damos por concluida la plenaria de la tarde. Un aplauso nuevamente a Peter. Gracias. Wells, ¿te vas a hacer un anuncio? Ahí vamos a hacer un último anuncio. El de mi parte es que yo tengo que abandonar el Congreso hoy, porque tengo que trasladarme a Limón mañana, entonces no los puedo acompañar mañana ni en la clausura. Y el otro es que va a ser el compañero para que se reúnan en el otro.
Sí, para algunos, los que tengan interés en ir a comer o algo así en algún lado, los que quieran ir, digamos, en grupo tal vez, que digan quiénes, entonces ahí nos vamos a reunir afuera para ver. Sí. Sí, no, es que cada quien por su sí, cada uno por su cuenta, pero sí, los que tengan interés de ir en grupo, yo sé que algunos van para San José, otros van para otros lados, entonces, pero de los que se quedan acá en Heredia, pues algún grupo, ¿verdad? Viviana, vamos a ir por acá cerca a un restaurante o algo así, a un lugar en Heredia, entonces, ese es el anuncio.